killed 129 people in Paris. Most of the slaughter took place in the Bataclan, a concert hall known for hosting pro-Israel events. Because of its affiliation with the Jewish people in their homeland, it has been the target of hostility and threats for years. In 2008, a group of young men wearing Palestinian keffiyehs over their faces came to the concert hall and complained about an event being held in support of Israel's border police. Apparently, the idea that the concert hall would be used to support people who stand between Israeli citizens and jihadists who want to kill them was simply intolerable to these folks. If the concert hall continued to host these events, one of the masked thugs said, the people will not take it anymore, and you will pay the consequences of your actions. The next time, we will not come to talk. You can see this confrontation on YouTube. I don't get it. You put on a mask over your head, but then you post a video on YouTube. Such is the logic of jihadism. Jihadists planned an attack against the concert hall in 2011, but the French police thwarted this attack. One of the conspirators told officials after his capture, we had planned an attack against the Bataclan because the owners were Jewish. He was a member of a group that called itself the Army of Islam. Finally, 3 days ago, jihadists from Syria made good on these threats, killing scores of people attending a rock concert. Sadly, we live in a world where the one thing we can really bank on is jihadist threats. Jihadists keep their word. They promise violence, they give us violence. If the people who specifically make these threats cannot make good on their promise, one of their friends and allies will. If Al-Qaeda can't do it, ISIS will. And to make matters worse, jihadist threats are oftentimes more reliable than the promises and assurances from the captains of media who promise us that they will promptly and accurately inform us about world events. All too often, they do not make good on their promises. The BBC is one of the worst offenders. For example, during Israel's war with Hamas in 2012, the BBC claimed, with ample evidence to the contrary, Israel for the tragic death of Omar Mishrawi. You remember the photo. He was the little boy whose body was wrapped in a shroud and held by his weeping father at the hospital in Gaza. It was a terrible scene. It was a huge tragedy. His father worked for the BBC. In a piece written by correspondent John Donison, the network pushed a narrative in which Israel was invariably at fault for the boy's tragic death. Donison's piece acknowledged that some bloggers had stated that the damage to Mishrawi's house was inconsistent with the destruction caused by Israeli rockets. But to preserve his narrative of Israeli guilt, BBC correspondent John Donison wrote, the BBC visited other bomb sites this week with very similar fire damage where Israel acknowledged carrying out what it called surgical strikes. The BBC's correspondent did everything he could to push the narrative of Israeli wrongdoing, and the network let him. Then the United Nations issued a report stating that Mishrawi's death was likely the result of a Hamas missile that fell short. The bloggers, in their pajamas, got it right, and the BBC got it wrong. The BBC put a small update at the bottom of Donison's article telling them about the UN report, but the damage had been done. Because of BBC's failure of journalistic skepticism, millions of viewers have been given the false impression that the Israelis killed the baby son of a BBC employee. The image of the father weeping, holding his dead child has become an icon of outrage, a prop to be displayed by Israel haters everywhere to demonize the Jewish state and Jews who regard Israel as their homeland. Misinformation, irresponsibly broadcast by the BBC, has become an ideological stone to be picked up and thrown by Israel haters at their convenience. This was not the only time the BBC has behaved in such a manner. In its coverage of the deaths of 13 Palestinians, 11 of them children, near Shifa Hospital in Gaza in 2014, it presented Hamas's versions of events, that the deaths were caused by Israeli rockets, as a reasonable explanation for these deaths, even though the IDF had video of Hamas-fired rockets falling into the area at the time of the explosion. In a number of reports, the BBC portrayed Israeli and Hamas's explanations for what happened as having equal credibility. The BBC would have us believe that it cannot possibly tell which of them is more reliable, my colleague Kadar Sailor reported. The evidence provided by a sophisticated system of radars and trackers, which are part of a technologically advanced early warning system, or the unverified word of health officials belonging to a terrorist organization, which, if it did not fire the specific missiles itself, is collaborating with the organization that did. Under its charter, the BBC is charged with pursuing a number of goals. One of them is to sustain citizenship and civil society. And the BB's website states, you can trust the BBC to provide high-quality news, current affairs, and factual programming that keeps you informed and supports debate about important issues and political developments in an engaging way. When it comes to the Jewish homeland, the BBC does not keep this promise. The BBC has concluded that just as long as its stories are engaging and interesting, it is okay to allow its correspondents in Gaza to serve as a propaganda arm for Hamas, an anti-Semitic totalitarian organization that oppresses its own people and seeks to exercise a veto over Jewish national life in the modern state of Israel. And to pursue this agenda, it demonizes Jews everywhere. As documented by Camera's affiliate UK Media Watch, BBC helps broadcast Hamas's hostile narrative. And all of you here today know all too well the consequences of this lethal narrative. You live in the United States, but you live and study under the shadow of this narrative. Last week, students at Hunter College blamed the school's so-called Zionist administration for high tuition. Students chanted Zionist out of Sunni, and there is only one solution, intifada, revolution. A speaker at the rally yelled to the crowd, our administration is infected with Zionism, and this is the sin we're fighting against. One protester said Israelis don't belong in Palestine and should go back to LA. These folks don't want Jews in Israel, and they don't want them on campus. These folks direct more of their rage at Israel than they do at ISIS. They stage fake Israeli checkpoints but do not protest the beheadings. They build fake security barriers to condemn Israel, and they hand out mock eviction notices. But where are the mock executions of Christians by ISIS? Where are the mock slave auctions of Yazidi slave victims? These people are not enemies of ISIS, and that is the problem. If you are not an enemy of ISIS, you are no friend of human rights. You are no friend of freedom. You are no friend of Israel. You are no friend of America. And you are no friend of the West. College administrators have allowed anti-Israel activists to menace and abuse their fellow students who support Israel on college campuses on a regular basis for well over a decade. Jews have been threatened, assaulted, and harassed on college campuses in the U.S. because their homeland has been demonized as a monstrous nation by its enemies. And sadly enough, news outlets such as the BBC have all too often cooperated with this demonization. But the last thing the people who came here today will do is adopt the pose of fragile snowflakes who will cave in to this bullying. You are no self-pitying snowflakes. You are enemies of ISIS. You are men and women who came to stand up to the lethal narrative directed at Israel and the Jewish people. Whether you are a Jew or not, you came here to send a message to the British government. Your message is that you are on to BBC's ugly tendency to slant its coverage in favor of those who seek Israel's destruction and against those who call it their homeland. It is time for the people who run the BBC to quit with the demonization and start with the honest journalism. I must say that you have got a lot of nerve showing up here on a day like this, so soon after a spectacular jihadist attack. If I were your parents, I would have told you to sleep in today, just in case. But you showed up. And by showing up, you declared yourselves publicly enemies of ISIS. You declared yourselves to be friends of human rights, an ally of France in her time of trial, proud Zionists, and proud Americans. So may God bless you all and keep you gathered here today, for you are a blessing to your families, to your campuses, to your fellow students, and to your fellow Americans. May God make his face to shine upon you, sharpen your minds, and strengthen your hearts for the challenges that will surely present themselves in the days and years ahead. Forward, march!